right, so before we break for lunch and more time with posters and campus teams to talk more deeply about some of these very interesting issues that are being raised this morning, we have time with Adrianna Kezar. And Adrianna is Associate Professor for Higher Education at the University of Southern California. And Adrianna has been working for a long time in leadership and institutional change in higher ed, published profusely, if you read her bio. And we've used in this project her book from published last year with co-author Jaime Lester, a book called Organizing Higher Education for Collaboration. And that's been a very inspirational book for us. And chapter 12 is actually reprinted in the appendix section of your book. And chapter 12 you might peruse before lunch because it actually identifies, just quickly, just zip through. It's a Project Kaleidoscope meeting. But chapter 12, and I don't know if Adrianna plans to talk about this, but talks about what different stakeholder groups and constituent groups can do to promote collaboration. I think a lot of what we're talking about in organizing these kinds of programs is collaboration. So I won't take any more of her time, but I will just lastly say that she's been the program evaluator for this project, and so has been with us for the whole 3 years and been talking with the teams separately from what we've been asking them to report, as well as interacting with the leadership of the project. So Adrianna, without further ado, thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you, Susan, and it's good to see everybody, and I'm glad she reminded everybody that I'm standing between you and lunch. But I will try to go through my comments quickly and make some cogent points that I think will help bring you to the afternoon discussion. And I do want to thank everybody for being so gracious with their time when I contacted you via email or phone for the evaluation. I really, really appreciated it, and I know PKAL did as well. And I think my role at some level is to synthesize for you some of the different ideas that you've heard so far, as well as various work that's come together about this notion of how we can support interdisciplinary work. And I'm going to mention Julie Klein's work a little bit. It's already been mentioned, the Facilitating Interdisciplinary Research Report, PKAL's own work and research, and my own. They all come together and have the same message, which is always powerful and wonderful when things come together like that. So, it's not just dumb luck. Maybe there's something to this research that is actually true. And I want to pick up on Jim's comment. He said, we've got to attend to the structure of the institutions. If these institutions aren't committed to this work, if they're not thinking about how they're organized, is this really going to be sustained? Is this something that is an actual commitment of the institution? So that's what I want to focus on. So I'll give away my main premise, which I don't think will be surprising to any of you, and it's based on having spent about 10 or 12 years studying not just interdisciplinary work, but I've been studying different kinds of collaborative work on campuses. So service learning, learning communities, student academic affairs, collaboration, a whole series of different kinds of collaborative work, including interdisciplinary research and teaching. And one of the things that becomes very obvious as you look at any of these innovations is that they find themselves trying to fit within the siloed bureaucratic structures that we have set up that are not supportive of collaborative work. So each of these different forms of collaborative work suffer the same problems. So you see it across. So all of the conversations you have about the difficulties in interdisciplinarity, we see in all these other innovations. So it's not unique. It's something about the nature of trying to do more collaborative work. And to be successful at this, we need to rethink, and I'll say rethink because the word redesign and reorganize I know gets scary, sounds too big, but I think it's really just rethink our structures and move towards changing them. Most of you know this from trying to do this work, but we back away from it because it brings up all sorts of backlash and resistance. So we move away from it and we focus on the most incremental kinds of structural and cultural changes we can absolutely make, which is not a bad thing. We need to make some progress. You need to tinker. You need to get those incremental changes. So my ultimate message is that you need the small tinkering changes to get the momentum. That's important, but to try to do both the incremental change as you move towards greater redesign is important. And if any of you have read Julie Klein's book, we've both been doing research at the same time, came to this same conclusion that ultimately this is what's going to sustain these kinds of collaborative works in higher education institutions. I want to just talk about two of the data sources for some of the conclusions I'm going to present, only because I think they're interesting to some of the earlier comments you were having about how do we justify interdisciplinary work, what's the argument for it. And so one of the projects I worked on was something called Project Deep, and it came out of Indiana University. This is where George Koo is, and he came up with the high impact practices you've all been talking about in engagement. And we went around to 20 institutions that were performing higher than expected on the NESI, which I know a lot of you are familiar with NESI and use it on your campuses. And what was really interesting was that these campuses that scored higher than projected on engagement had these collaborative kinds of activities and processes going on. Perhaps not shocking. And what was unique, though, was they had done some of this work to try to change the structure of their institutions to support it. So we were seeing that connection between higher levels of engagement, higher student learning, much more collaborative kinds of structures, doing interdisciplinary work, doing learning communities, doing student academic affairs collaboration, and then them trying to fiddle with the institution to try to support this work so that it wouldn't become something that, because otherwise the students, as Jim said, experience our institutions in these very disorganized, disaggregated ways that is really hard for them to absorb. So these institutions were moving beyond that. That piqued my interest in looking at, so I looked at a set of institutions that were very collaborative to say, so what's the mix? What's the mix of things that you can put together that really support then collaborative work? So it's built off of this earlier work that NESI and DEEP had been doing. One of the things that's nice is that at the same time as I was doing this research in about sort of from 2002 to 2005, the Facilitating Interdisciplinary Research Report did its own synthesis and suggested very similar things that I'm going to talk to you about. So this is how all the pivot points are coming together. They acknowledged a lot of the things that I'm sure you've talked about in terms of the barriers to interdisciplinary work, and then I'm just going to highlight here some of the things that they talked about in terms of what needs to be redesigned or organized. So they're talking about addressing reward structures, and they're talking about creating departmental policies and procedures that relate to interdisciplinary work, how we need to think about the budget structures, the hiring and promotion, and the ways to promote interaction. So this is some of the things that you've talked about in terms of conversation. So much of their report highlights many of the things you're doing in the PKAL project, and just to reiterate, my own research came up with all of these extremely unsupportive structures that we don't need to spend a lot of time on because you all experience them regularly. But what I continued to see outside of the kinds of institutions that I went to that were highly, had highly collaborative and supportive environments, there was a recognition for them that they needed to transform their environments. And I see that a lot of campuses that I go to that want to foster collaborative work have trouble embracing the notion that they have to do any kind of fundamental rethinking of their structure. So this is that disconnect. So we need to move beyond it. We need to say, if we're in this for the long haul, then we've got to commit to actually looking at our institutions. What are the rewards? What are the incentives? What are the, how do particular departments maybe need to be shifted, spaces moved? How do we think about teaching load? All of that needs to be addressed. Our policies and procedures at least need to be thought about. I wanted to compare what came out in the study to PKAL's final report in terms of there's a lot of parallel work. In terms of one of the key underpinnings that I found at these institutions is they started with some good and hard conversations about their educational philosophy, their values, and their mission. And the PKAL final report talks about that in its recommendations 1, 2, and 5, about achieving a common understanding, using assessment to connect to campus priorities, and connecting to institutional mission. So those are all the kinds of things that I saw at these institutions that were very supportive of collaborative work. They did that. They tackled, whether it was at a departmental level or at the institutional level, thinking about, does our mission support collaborative work, and how can we rethink it then? What are the kinds of values that we have on campus for our students? They also, was very important to build social networks and set up communities of practice. They intentionally connected people who were either trying to do service learning, trying to do interdisciplinary work. They didn't just leave it to hopefully happening, that people will connect and find each other. And that's very similar to the PKAL report on building a critical mass of faculty. You have to do that if you want to be successful at this work. Otherwise, people are isolated, and they find themselves not only not feeling that there are people who have the same level of enthusiasm for the work that they do, but they also need that level of support to go through promotion and tenure. Who are people across campus who will support and understand their work? There's lots of reasons that this critical mass of people is important to building support for interdisciplinarity. They did things like build what I called integrating structures. So they really went and said to be successful at interdisciplinary work, we've got to create a center for poverty. We've got to create a center for environmental sciences and give support to that center and decentralize budgets so that it's easier for campuses to connect different programs. And we've got to get rid of, so often people said, we recognize what stood in our way of interdisciplinary work was our computer systems and our accounting systems and how they would account for things. This was this big insight about that's the whole reason we weren't doing it, so they investigated other accounting and computer systems, and use technology to facilitate more collaboration, the way you can do blogs and websites and social media to connect people, and doing kind of Facebook for different kinds of groups that want to connect on campus. So they were really savvy with what I'll call these integrating structures, and it's one of the things that did not come up as much across this project, so it's one thing that I wanted you to attend to. So I'm going to point out those things where there was a lot of synergy with the work I've done, and those things that PKAL and the campuses may want to think about. Incentives, of course, we all know this, but these campuses had difficult, brutal, I have a long chapter on this, difficult, brutal discussions around promotion and tenure and incentives, and trying to create an important space for interdisciplinary and, again, collaborative work. I'm also talking about staff and how they redid evaluations to support staff for collaborative work. So there's many ways that we need to continue to think about our reward structures, and I know they're the hardest. So I have a lot of space and time in the book if anybody is willing to go down that path. There are some really good success stories about how people have done that. These campuses leverage the support from groups like this and from NSF and from whatever report they can find that supports their work. So it was really good to see the reports up here that would support interdisciplinary work in your thinking, because these campuses leverage those external messages and thoughts to get support, because our campuses are very driven by external prestige and messages, and those make a big difference.